to introduce Jacob. He's a specialist in net zero building design, energy modeling, and geothermal systems. A 14-year veteran of the industry, he is the principal and lead mechanical engineer at Revolve Engineering, Inc., which he started 10 years ago. Jacob has helped design over 10 net zero buildings and more than 40 commercial geothermal systems on a variety of projects ranging from multi-story commercial office buildings to apartment buildings and government facilities. So Jacob is joining us from Alberta, but he does work all over Canada. So welcome, Jacob. So happy to have you here, and take it away.
Thanks, Laura. And welcome, everybody. Glad to be invited to chat. I'm just going to share my screen here. I was just last minute. I just got an idea. I think it was something you said, and I was like, I'm going to dump a couple more slides into my presentation. So it's last minute thing. Hopefully it's not apparent. Okay. Share. Can everybody see this?
Looking good to me.
Okay, perfect. And can you also, if I draw, can you see the scribbles?
Yes, we can.
Awesome.
I just watching the kid.
I'll just get that person muted.
Perfect. So, hello everyone. My name is Jacob, and my background is mechanical HVAC, but moved more into sustainable buildings and geodesign and fun stuff. We've been lucky to work on a lot of net zero projects and fun projects, and this presentation is sort of a lessons learned, so to speak, and hopefully it will, because our thinking has changed over the years as we've worked with the projects, as well it should have, right? As we learn more information, we're going to change our approach. So I'm going to start with the depressing intro. And I'm not going to show you pictures of polar bears or anything like that, but I'd like to frame the conversation around climate change, because if anything that COVID has showed us recently is how drastically and dramatically and overnight our world can change in the face of a crisis. And climate change is going to make COVID look like a bad cold. So not looking at the building industry and what's going to happen over the next 10 years in the context of climate change, I think would be having a huge blind spot. So it all centers around this 1.5 degree target that we're trying to reach, which means essentially the world has a carbon budget of 2,500 gigatons, it's 600 of that is left. That was in 2011. And Edmonton, where I am, signed on to what's called the Edmonton Declaration when we hosted the IPCC conference a few years back. And so that committed us to this 1.5 degree target. So the city of Edmonton did some awesome modeling to see, okay, what would we have to do to reach this 1.5 degree target? And we currently emit about 18 to 20 megatons per year. And so this is based on the modeling, what we would need to do to get to zero. And that is basically a 30% reduction by 2023 and an 80% reduction or so by 2030, which obviously is a staggering amount. I don't know if you heard that worldwide emissions decreased by 9% because of COVID. We have to do that every single year from now until we run out of emissions, and without causing mass chaos and hunger and all that. So it's a huge challenge. And so one of the reasons I bring this up in the context of if you're building a brand new building and you're going to install a fossil fuel boiler or furnace, and construction's finished, let's say this year, you're hoping that that building lasts a minimum of 50 years. So that takes you well past 2070 and beyond. And so you can probably see where I'm going. The world needs to be off fossil fuels by 2050, and all new buildings have to be net zero ready by 2030 via the Pan-Canadian framework, and we need that 81% emissions reductions. So for the majority of the life of the building, you're either not going to want to or be allowed to use fossil fuels. in that building. And so there's going to be all this pressure as governments and municipalities and provinces try to meet these targets, which are quite ambitious. And so we're going to see a lot of pressure over the next 10 years. So there's a bunch of things that can happen. One is I think we can see natural gas prices spike. And this can be a surprise to a lot of people because we had record low natural gas prices over the last 15 years. But most people don't realize that every single shale play in the US has peak production, 2020 being here. Even the Marcellus, the largest shale play in the US, has peak production. And Alberta, where I am, peaked production a long time ago, in 2020 being here. Again, production declining every year after. And meanwhile, consumption is going up every single year, especially as we switch natural coal power plants, well, in Alberta anyways, to natural gas. We're using more and more natural gas, and the US is doing this as well. But somehow prices didn't spike, and we've had record production. And so I'll get to why that was in a second. But we're also exporting more and more natural gas to overseas with LNG. And in the context of this, producers are struggling to keep up with the demand. And if you remember that for every ounce, it's not like solar where you get endless power. Every ounce of natural gas you use, you have to replace. And because fracking wells have really high decline rates, meaning they produce really high rates for the first few years and then they fall off a cliff, producers are really struggling to keep output flat. And this is why the energy information industry is forecasting significant decreases in production over the next few years. And if you add to that, in the context of what's been going on in the shale industry in the last 15 years, not a single shale driller for natural gas has made any money over the last decade because prices have been too low. And the only reason they kept going is because they were fed by Wall Street debt looking for returns, and they were valued based on production numbers, which kept going up. But now that's not true anymore, and they're looking for a return. And so all these producers are getting absolutely hammered. So Chesapeake, which was one of the pioneers of fracking, has filed for bankruptcy protection just recently, and there's a huge consolidation going on in the market. I encourage you to read about it. It's quite a mess. But the reason that prices haven't spiked and why production of natural gas has been high, even though you can see the Marcellus reduced production, all the shale plays are either flat or declining, is because of associated gas. And associated gas is essentially natural gas that comes along with fracking for oil. So when they frack for oil, natural gas comes along with it. And with the COVID pandemic and the collapse of oil prices, this associated gas is disappearing. And so you're seeing the production numbers collapse, but we didn't see prices spike because COVID caused demand to drop significantly. So that's why we didn't have price spike until this winter when we first had finally that cold snap. And you can see prices went from about less than $2 at the beginning of the year to $3, and they spiked to $6 a couple of weeks ago when the prices spiked. So this is the future. I by no means am saying I know what's going to happen to prices, but if you expect the next decade of natural gas prices to be what it was in the past, then I think it'll be a big surprise. So I think that's one of the big key factors we're going to see over the next 10 years. And I used to say, well, carbon taxes might triple, and because we needed a big carbon tax price to reach our targets, but that obviously has already happened. So I'm going to replace this with a natural gas ban. My prediction is that by mid decade, that natural gas will be banned in new developments. And some people will just call me crazy, but I'll remind you that New York, San Francisco, San Jose, and dozens of other cities have already instituted such bans, basically banning natural gas. And It might seem far away now, but in the context of the net zero buildings that we're going to be building, um, I think it's a very real possibility, sooner than you might think. And then, of course, renewable energy is going to keep dropping. Solar and wind are already the cheapest forms of energy generation. Solar has dropped 80% in the last decade and is projected to drop another 70% in the next decade, meaning that energy prices from solar and wind are going to be not free, but very, very cheap. Meanwhile, battery prices have also dropped 87% the last decade and are projected to drop another 80%, which means we're going to see more and more storage happening on the grid as well as for buildings. And so when you look at Tony Seba just came out with a great presentation showing that 100 you can get 100% renewables with solar, wind, and batteries by 2030, just with the declining cost of renewables. So you overproduce with solar and wind, and then you get batteries. I encourage you to look up Tony Seba presentation. So when renewables get that low, you're going to be crazy to pay a high price for carbon taxes and natural gas when you can get a renewable electric system for much cheaper. So I think we're basically at the tipping point of what is considered risky. And it might seem like the safe thing to do to install a natural gas boiler, but right now I think we've reached a tipping point where it's the riskiest thing you can do, because you're most likely going to have to pay to rip it out and replace it with a renewable system within the next 10 years. It's simply, there's too many things working against you. All of the things I mentioned between carbon taxes. I encourage you to look up your own energy bills and your usage with the 2030 tax rate. The 2030 carbon tax cost is huge. And a lot of people think that this, again, this will take time. It's not, I'm crazy. This is, so far ahead. But just to show you how quickly things can move, this is a picture of New York in the year 1900. And can anybody find the only car on the street? It's right here. That was the only car on that street in 1900. The same street, the same parade in 1913, 13 years later, there is one horse on that street. Horses were completely disrupted and replaced by automobiles. And for a more recent example, Kodak was at the height of their profits and revenue in the year 2000. The CEO was gloating that picture taking is an all-time high. 12 years later, Kodak is no longer in company. And for businesses that don't accept or don't realize the risk that climate change poses on their production capacity, their resources, and their bottom line are fundamentally going to be disrupted, and they're going to disappear. And because technological adoptions happen on an S-curve, whether it's the car, or telephone, or TV, almost every technological adoption follows an S-curve. And what you'll find is that most recent, you can see the S-curves getting steeper. And I think this probably speaks more to our connected culture and psychology than anything. But you can see that almost everything follows an S-curve. And so what I think the building industry is going to look like, partially because we know we require net zero buildings to be by 2030 via the Pan-Canadian framework. So the S-curve for net zero buildings is going to look something like this. So do you really want to install a system here when you know you're going to be ripping it out here? And the City of Edmonton modeling basically shows the same thing. So to achieve our targets, we know that all new buildings have to be net zero before 2030. We have to retrofit all of our homes and buildings before 2050 with a 50% reduction in electricity and heating. And most of that energy has to come from solar PV. So that's not a big surprise, but we do have to keep in mind that for a typical home, only 15% of the energy is electricity. The rest is natural gas for heating and hot water. So we need to start addressing this 85%. So how do we do it? We know we need net zero buildings. And most of the approach in the, I think the most logical approach, and I always thought this way too, is let's add insulation, right? Let's reduce the demand. It makes the most sense. And most people don't know that Edmonton had at one point, I don't know if this is still true, the most net zero homes of any city in Canada. All of the attempts were with really passive approaches. So, R100 ceiling, double stud, R50, 60 walls, quad pane, triple pane windows, really tight, ERVs, everything. The whole point is to reduce the space heating demand by 70, 80%, and then, worry about the rest after, whether it's with an air source heat pump or electric space heating. And the one thing I'll say is this practical for renovations? Most of the buildings that are still around today are still going to be around in 30 years. So is this practical for renovations? Do we really expect people to move out of their homes while we retrofit their envelope with a 16-inch stud wall? And actually, is this practical even for new builds based on the costs that we have to invest in all these things? So if we look at a typical Alberta home, or any home built in Canada, Dustin, I'm just gonna mute you, unless you wanted to ask a question, but let me know. So a home built in the last 15 years, which actually isn't anymore, oops, apologies, which isn't that much more efficient than the average home in Alberta. So anything built in the last 15 years, let's take this home, standard 2x6 R20 batt wall, R16, 17 effective, typical R40 dual pane windows, typical infiltration. Let's say you replaced your furnace, no HRV, typical hot water tank, and let's say you're pretty good with your plug loads. You have LEDs and you turn off your lights and TVs and stuff like that. So to get to net zero, I'm going to assume half the roof area is available for PV. So based on 13 kilowatts, our energy budget's conservatively 13,000 kilowatt hours. So I'm going to add triple pane windows, R20 effective walls, and R50 roof. And that gets us like an 18% energy improvement. Great. That gets down to 31. I'm going to change the weather file in my model to a more recent file. So because the climate has warmed, so that helps us a tiny bit. I'm going to add insulation in the floor and take the walls up to R30. That gets us down to 25.8. So that's still not getting us there. So let's go full passive house, R40 in the foundation, R50 wall, R80 roof, Duxton fiberglass triple pane windows. That gets us down to 20. Still not where we need to be. So then we add electric space heating and an air source heat pump for domestic hot water. That gets us down to 16.5. HRV doesn't do anything, partly because of the way we install them. If we improve the infiltration and we add air source heat pump for heating, obviously with backup, that gets us down to 11.6. So we're at our net zero point. So we're at net zero, but look at all we have to do. Insulation in the floors, foundation, thick walls, roof, fiberglass windows. Like, is anybody excited about the future of net zero buildings, about what every homeowner has to do, about everything we need to do for retrofits, to retrofit all of these buildings? What is the cost of all these upgrades? So, and again, I'm going to go back, is this practical for renovations? Do we really expect people to move out of their homes while we change their walls to 16 inches thick and reduce their living space? And how do we add insulation into the floors? And we have to remember that it's not as simple as just simply adding insulation. That obviously can be expensive, especially for retrofit, but you need trades that know how to install these trades. I'm sure there's competent people, and we have in Alberta, people that can build a double stud wall in their sleep, but the typical building contractor doesn't know how to do that. And of course, you can reduce your living area. You have narrow lots and setbacks, which could prevent you from putting insulation on the outside. And you have to understand building physics. It's not as simple as adding insulation. Your dew point changes. So you have risk of condensation. You need to understand how your envelope breathes. And also, especially for multi-story buildings, you actually have a risk of overheating. And overheating simply just when the space becomes too warm, and you have increased risk of heat stress, heat stroke. This is especially dangerous for seniors and a vulnerable population. So all of the heat gains from your space, from your fridge and cooking on a hot day, your solar gains, and especially in apartments where you only have one face. So even if you open your windows, you don't have cross flow or anything like that. Overheating can become a real issue, especially as we tighten up these envelopes. And what we're seeing that with multi-story buildings, we're seeing a lot of these suites in our sunny climate. Winnipeg, Manitoba, Winnipeg's one of the sunniest cities in Canada. So is Edmonton and Calgary. We're seeing a lot of overheating, up to 30 degrees in these suites that weren't cooled. And opening the window doesn't help that much because you don't get any cross flow. This project, over 30% of the year, the suite was over 25 degrees. And this isn't even a passive design. This is R20 walls, R40 roof, and triple pane windows. So as you tighten up that, it only gets worse. And of course, this is only going to get worse with a warming climate, right? We're going to get more hotter days and we're going to get milder winters. I'll remind you that in 2003, 30,000 people died in Europe from the heat wave that they had. This is a real risk. Add to that COVID, people trapped indoors. Add to that forest fires that prevent people from opening windows, and you can have real problems. So what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is to move the needle away from a fully passive design and to start incorporating more active systems in your design. So in that home, let's leave that concrete floor. Let's leave the walls and roof as is. Let's leave the air tightness. Let's install or upgrade the windows with a high solar heat gain coefficient. Let's change the hot water tank to an air source heat pump, and then let's add a ground source heat pump. And for people that aren't familiar with heat pumps, a ground source heat pump is exactly the same as an air source heat pump or an air conditioner. The refrigerant inside the heat pump has much different properties than what we're used to with water. It can boil at very low temperatures, like -degree temperatures. So if you imagine a -1 degree solution of water and glycol going to the ground, which is about 7 degrees in Edmonton, it picks up heat from the ground and this is at -4. It comes back, picks up heat from the ground and it comes back at -1. This -1 is enough to boil this refrigerant. So you get a vapor, a superheated or a vapor in on this side, and the compressor kicks in. And the compressor, if you know that click from your refrigerator, it simply increases the pressure and therefore the temperature. So you get a superheated vapor on this side that is at a temperature that can warm. You can pass it through a coil to heat up air or water. So now you can heat up your home. And as the refrigerant gives off heat, it condenses into a liquid, pass through an expansion valve, which rapidly lowers the pressure, and then the cycle starts all over again. And the heat pump has a reversing valve, so you can flip this cycle from heating and cooling. So then you're rejecting heat to the outside, which is exactly how a air conditioner works, except when it's hot outside, it's hard to reject heat outside. And similarly, an air source heat pump in heating, when you need the most heat is when it can deliver the least heat and it's the least efficient because there's less heat available in the air. But a ground source heat pump uses a stable earth temperature, so it's much more efficient and it doesn't care what the outside temperature is as long as you size it properly. So the whole point of using the ground source heat pump is to tap into the super high efficiencies that you can get from a ground source heat pump. So an average heat pump efficiency can be over 400%. An air source heat pump average can be over around 200%, although you will always have to rely on backup heat for when you need it. And so the polar vortex spells that we've had, most air source heat pumps aren't running, they're running electric backup heat. And then here's obviously high efficiency boilers at 90%. So when we compare the electric systems to this home, you can see that the energy usage is vastly different between each option. And this is what we're taking advantage of, is we're using the efficiency of the geosystem to reduce the energy usage. And so simply by adding triple pane windows, electrifying the hot water, and adding geo, we're almost at our 13,000. We've done no other upgrades to the envelope. And so this is just an easier way to get to net zero. And again, I'm going to say, I'm not saying that envelope isn't important or that you might not want to upgrade it. I'm just saying the efficiency of geo helps us to get there much easier. And so if you wanted to get there, you can improve the air tightness, which is probably the lowest hanging fruit. You can add an inch of rigid to the outside to get to that 12, to get below that 13,000, but that probably wasn't worth it. The whole point is that if you look at the original home, you have your heating demand here in blue. With a furnace, because it's less than 100% efficient, your energy consumption in orange is higher than your energy or your heating demand. With a passive approach, you reduce the heating demand, and then the mechanical system is really an afterthought. Whereas with the geo system, you still optimize the envelope. You do the things that are easy, like windows and maybe a little bit of envelope, past the point of diminishing returns. And then you use the efficiency of geo to divide that by 4, and so you get to almost the exact same spot. And so just to give you an idea, obviously every envelope has a diminishing return. So this is a project we were trying to get to net zero. So this is a standard roof, triple pane windows, and we're showing the wall R values from R5 all the way to R40. And so you can see that going from R5 to R10 has like a 15 or 18% improvement. That's great. R10 to R15, another 8% improvement. And after that, in a traditional standard 2x6 wall is about R17. So after that, you're only getting 2% or 1% improvement. And so obviously there's a diminishing return, and the cost is only going up from there. So you're putting more money for less and less gain. And if you attach a geosystem, because you're dividing that load by 4, that curve is even flatter. So what we're finding is that with geosystems, upgrading the envelope has almost no financial benefit. And again, I'm not saying you wouldn't want to install a better envelope for thermal comfort. I personally would, because I think our wall systems right now are pretty bad. But it means that you can optimize it for buildability and comfort instead of having to reach this R40 or R50 target, which is hard to build. So again, we can reach net zero with much more conventional envelopes. And the comparison between the two approaches is staggering in terms of what you have to do and getting people, convincing people to actually do this. And so just to give you an example, I rent this duplex, and of course I modeled it because I'm a huge nerd, and I track all of my energy, which for some reason is going up. I don't know. And I modeled it. It's the model lines up with the actual use pretty good, except for 1 month. And I estimated how much solar PV I could fit on the roof. So I gave myself a conservative energy budget of around 11,500. So if I put an electric hot water tank, add geo, and rip out the gas line and do nothing else, like this is 7-year-old home with dual pane windows. If I do nothing else, I can get to net zero just with the addition of geo. Again, I'm using the efficiency of the geo system to get to net zero. So in terms of convincing people to get to net zero, this is obviously going to be easy. Now there's one problem. I estimated that I would need 5 boreholes to get a fully geo system, but I only have room on my side for about 4. So I can drill deeper, but the problem with drilling deeper is it costs more. So if the 5 boreholes would cost about $20,000 for the drilling portion. If I go deeper, it's going to cost you more. So you might pay $35,000. So I don't necessarily want to do that. So there's a few things you can do that to avoid. One, you can rely on the electric backup, much like an air source heat pump for those 4 or 5 days when the temperatures from the ground loop aren't high enough, even though the heat pumps can handle a much lower temperature, they're just less efficient. I can upgrade the windows to triple pane, which reduce the load enough that I can easily get away with 4 boreholes. Or if I improve my air tightness a bit, again, I can get away with 4 boreholes. And that's likely the approach that we're going to have to take, especially with older homes and retrofit situation. Is one, I think the lowest hanging fruit is always going to be, especially in these older homes, is air tightness. They're so leaky oftentimes that you're going to want to attack that infiltration. And the easiest way that I've found is to use a product called air barrier, which essentially, like, imagine a blower door test, but they spray this like mist into the building, and that mist finds any leaks, and when the pressure, when it's going through them, it seals them up. And so this home, for example, went from 4 air changes per hour to 0.3 after the service, which is, it's just unbelievable. That's less than passive health level of infiltration. And I love this visualization that the 4 air changes is like a 220 square inch hole in your home, just all the time, just a hole in your envelope, constantly bringing in fresh air. So this is a huge energy savings, can save you 30 to 40%. I think in these older homes, again, they often have really bad windows, so you can easily get 10 to 20%. And again, I recommend using a high solar heat gain coefficient, because when you attach geo, you have cooling, and we're more efficient in cooling. So you're not worried about overheating. It allows us to use a higher solar heat gain and push that building more towards cooling. So just to give you a real example, we did a duplex, and this is a brand new build. It was a better envelope than standard, so we had exterior insulation. It was an R27 wall, R50 roof. We did have triple pane windows. There was insulation in the floor. That was done for thermal comfort reasons. There was drain water heat recovery, HRVs. And we only needed 2 boreholes per side. And that was actually part of the reason why we improved the envelope, is we wanted to keep the drilling to a minimum just for the footprint. So you only needed 2 boreholes per side, so less than $8,000 for the drilling costs. And we used a mid-efficiency heat pump. Our energy usage was just over 10,000 kilowatt hours. And based on the roof space we had, we could easily reach net zero. We compared the predicted energy usage versus the actual in orange, which was better than expected, although this building wasn't occupied. So it was kept at a constant 18 degrees. So obviously we would have used a little bit more, but we would have also had internal gains from people. And just for comparison, this is my duplex on natural gas, just to show you the staggering difference between geo and a traditional system. And so if you extrapolate this to bigger buildings, multi-unit buildings, which if you think about it, each one of these blocks, these apartments, has about 4,000 to 5,000 kilowatt hours of energy gain from plug loads, from cooking, from appliances and TVs and all that. But they only have one small wall to lose heat to, because they're sharing all these walls and roofs. So these buildings can become a lot more cooling dominant, but the approach that with geo is actually even better, because we have to worry about the envelope even less. Just by adding geo, doing no other upgrades, we reduced the space heating by 60%, space cooling by 65%, and hot water by 75%. Overall, when you account for the plug loads, it's a 35% energy reduction, and that's now a big portion. This is the savings. Your biggest energy portion now is lighting and plug loads. Your heating and cooling are now a small portion. And the interesting thing is this building is cooling dominant because of the large windows, the south and west exposures, and a sunny climate. It's very cooling dominant. So we found is we needed 108 boreholes at 183 meters or 600 feet. And the ground temperature was actually going up over time. So we would have had to increase the spacing or add more boreholes to make it more stable. But instead, what we did is we added domestic hot water demands, the preheat for the domestic hot water, to the ground loop. And so we basically create this much bigger heating demand. And so now our heating is bigger than our cooling. But because the energy we add to the compressor that 1 unit of heat that we add to the compressor means that heat doesn't have to come from the ground, whereas in cooling, the heat that we add to the compressor has to also be rejected by the ground. So it's heat of compression or rejection. That means that this is actually a very balanced load. And what we were able to do is reduce the number of boreholes to 80 boreholes at 600 feet. So a reduction of 28 boreholes and a huge cost. And now we get a more balanced system that runs much more efficiently. And we ran the numbers on this building. You saved 44,000 in the first year on energy and maintenance. The carbon tax in 2030, just the carbon tax cost for these buildings was going to be $46,000 a year. The first cost, we estimated around $530,000. The good news is, well, there's a couple. One, there's a provision in the tax system called the accelerated capital cost allowance. It allows you to depreciate the heat pumps and the geothermal field at 100% in the first year. That means you can write off the entire value of that asset immediately instead of 4% per year, which basically means you get a first huge credit depending on your tax rate in the first year. So for this client, it reduced the payback to 1 year. The other thing we found once we moved into detailed design is because the geo design doesn't require the cooling towers, the chillers, and the boilers, we were able to reduce the size of the penthouse on the roof. And at $200 per square foot, we were able to shave $350,000 off the cost of the penthouse. So this upfront cost premium really went down to like $200,000. So just to look at some more commercial examples, as Laura mentioned, we've done over 40 designs. Most of them have been operating for 10, 15 years. And to give you a couple more commercial examples, this was a college. We were trying to get to net zero, so we were looking at different envelope improvements. So going from R20 to R27 walls was going to cost 240 grand with a savings of 4 to 7%. Triple pane fiberglass windows was going to cost 300,000 plus with 5 to 8% savings. And ground source heat pumps was going to cost 300,000, although we can actually remove the boiler and chiller, so it's more like 200,000. And the energy savings is 40 to 50%. The point is that building upgrades aren't, they're not always the same. Some give you way more bang for buck. And geo is one of the high ones. The best one I would say is energy recovery on the fresh air. That's still one of your lowest hanging fruit. So for 40 grand, we reduce the heating energy by 20 to 40%. We always recommend first putting money into energy recovery, even before a geo system. To give a more office type example, this was our first attempt at net zero for a commercial building. This is in Edmonton. So obviously we reduced the lighting demands by using daylighting as much as possible. We went through every single plug load in the building. We figured out exactly where the energy is going. Interesting tidbit is coffee is 3% of the building energy use. And actually all the energy in the kitchen was more than all of the computers in the building. But the key takeaway from commercial building, even in our cold climates, is that most commercial buildings are actually cooling dominant. And what I mean by that is that they actually spend more time and require more energy in cooling than heating. And that's because of, one, in our sunny climates, solar gains, because of gains from people, from lighting, computers, and equipment that are on for a large portion of the time, and especially interior space. If you think of an interior meeting room, which has no outside walls, it's basically cooling all of the time. So the Mosaic Center, which was a 30,000 square foot building, for example, this graph shows they had just moved in. It was February, and this red line shows the temperature. So it was between -10 and -15 outside. The green line shows the temperature of the water coming from the ground loop, and the blue line is the temperature of the water going back to the ground loop. And so what we can see during the afternoon in February, as soon as you see the sun hit that south wall and those solar gains come in, we are rejecting heat to the ground loop. This building is rejecting at -10 to -15. And that was, the building was only about 20% occupied. Now there's a restaurant in there. So this building is most likely heating, cooling down to -15 or -20. And that doesn't mean every heat pump in the building's heating. The ones on the north are probably heating, but every internal and south zone is cooling. And so we saw that the entire week. At night, we're heating. During the day, when the people show up, all those internal gains and the sun hits that wall, we're rejecting heat to the ground loop. And so that's actually great news, and it's a lesson learned for envelopes for commercial buildings, especially because of those internal gains. There's no reason to have a great envelope. What we found in the Mosaic Center in our energy modeling is that we actually would increase the energy usage if we actually added envelope, because we would actually increase the cooling demand. And in this building, we looked at electric, air source heat pump, and geo options. There is no practical air source heat pump option for a commercial building like this, so this is a theoretical example. But just to illustrate this point, with these two systems, the lighting, plug loads, and everything are all the same, but the heating and cooling energy usage is different, which means that you need a different amount of solar PV to get to net zero. And the cost of that solar PV is different. So even though the cost of the geo system was an $80,000 premium, we would save $300,000 almost over electric space heating and $130,000 over air source heat pumps, which again, wouldn't be practical. And we didn't actually have enough room on the roof to fit this amount of PV. So not only is the geosystem the only way you would get to net zero on this site, it's the cheapest way to get to net zero. Just to show you another quick example, we looked at retrofitting an office building to net zero. The town of Devon, it's a suburb of Edmonton, bought this building, wanted to retrofit it. So the base case, they wanted to improve the boiler, cooling tower, they wanted to upgrade the windows, and they wanted to we're going to leave the walls and roof as is. So the base energy usage on this upgraded is 223,000. We had enough room on the roof for 100 kilowatts of PV, so let's say conservatively around 100,000 kilowatt hours. So in the base case, 223, if we upgrade the walls R20 to R20, we get down to 203. Obviously not close to our 100. If we leave the walls as is, but improve the infiltration, we can get down even further. So from now on, let's leave the low infiltration. So now we upgrade the walls to R20, to R27, upgrade the walls to R40 and R60 roof. We're still not at our 100. Obviously, this is still gas-fired. So it's a 34% energy reduction, and they estimated the upgrade for the walls and roof to be around $350,000 to $650,000. So let's take that, call it passive scenario, and compare it to geo. So this is the base system with 0 upgrades except ground source heat pumps. We can get down to 106. It's a 52% energy reduction. If we do R20 walls with high infiltration, we get to net zero, but better off to leave it at R12 walls with low infiltration and add geo. And you can see that as you improve the building envelope, the geo energy usage drops very minimally, again, because we flatten that curve. And envelope upgrades don't really make much sense. And so when we compare the cost of the envelope, call it 350, and the solar PV we would need, which in this case would still not get you net zero because it's natural gas. But adding geo for 253,000 reduces the amount of solar. And so when we go through all of these scenarios, we found that the cheapest is to leave the walls as is. It makes the geo system bigger than if the, obviously if the envelope was better, but the optimal is much better if we simply use the efficiency of the geo system. So again, the takeaway is that geo is the easiest way to net zero. The envelope improvements probably won't make a financial saying. But again, I want to say that I'm not saying envelope isn't important. For thermal comfort and other reasons, you obviously might still want to do it. But the envelope isn't the primary driver of energy savings. Basically, it allows you to build for comfort and buildability. So some of the other advantages of geo, obviously besides the energy reduction, you reduce your operating costs, especially for commercial buildings. When you're cooling a lot, you're comparing to a traditional system with half the efficiency of a geo system. You reduce the maintenance costs. The systems are very easy to maintain. Every study that I've seen from ASHRAE has shown that geosystems are the lowest cost systems, typically a half or a third of traditional systems. They have the longest lifespan. The ground loop is basically there forever, and the ground source heat pumps have a life of 23 to 25 years. One of the problems with air source heat pumps, they're the same technology, but they're working way harder. So the life on them, and anecdotally, we've seen really high failure rates in cold climates. They're more comfortable because they deliver a lower temperature, so you get less heating and cooling spots or hot spots. Obviously, you don't need a boiler chiller. You have a smaller mechanic room. You have no gas main, no piping, and you get that future-proof electric building. The disadvantages of geo is that often they have a higher upfront cost. That isn't true for larger and complex buildings. We've worked on schools and other buildings where the geo system is actually cheaper than a traditional system, especially where you're comparing to like a VAV system, a variable air volume, where it's a complicated mechanical system. You can actually come out cheaper. You do require the land area. So if you don't have the room, or if you have expensive landscaping, you might have to dig it up. And one of the other things is it requires more expertise, and it requires more time in design. It requires coordinated design and detailed energy modeling. You can't just use the peak design days for sizing geosystem. That peak boiler and chiller, it's useless for geodesign because the energy is not coming from an outside source. With a boiler, as long as you keep paying your gas bill, you keep getting your energy. But that peak almost never happens. Most buildings spend 90% of their life at less than a third of the capacity. So for geo, we need to have detailed energy modeling to get building loads, which gives us the heating cooling balance. And then we export that to our software and we size it using software. A lot of problems in the past with geosystems was because rules of thumb were used and they weren't engineered, and that can create a lot of problems. I've seen some really horrific geo designs. And so the loads matter. This is the loads we got from a client, which showed the building very heating dominant, 660,000 for heating, only 23 for cooling. We ran the loads on our end. Our heating loads were almost half, and our cooling loads were 10 times as big. With their system, we would have needed 200 boreholes, and its system is still completely unstable. With ours, we only need 45 boreholes, and the system is completely stable. And this is what we would expect for a building that size, and we've installed many that operate just like this. So I just want to quickly go back to that space issue, because we've been building really big buildings and homes with very little room for the geosystems. So where are we going to fit all these systems? You know, we can't get rigs into these big backyards most of the time. And the reality is that we're probably going to have to go to district energy, where we share the resource. We basically have community systems where the geosystem is installed on a district scale, and you distribute that energy to many buildings at once. But that is also an opportunity because there's a lot of waste heat out there. One ice rink rejects 1,200 kilowatt hours of heat every year. We pay to cool the ice, and we pay to reject the heat. But that heat from ice can heat 90 of my duplexes. So that's a lot of duplexes. And so just to give you an idea, this is in Winnipeg, actually, a project with 2 ice rinks. And with the geosystem, the cooling loads are just massive for 1,671 kilowatt hours of year of waste heat for this plant. So there's a community center attached to the ice arena, which is quite heating dominant still, but it has cooling loads. So we attach that to the system, and it helps a little bit, but the geosystem is still just overheating. It's just way too big and it's overheating. So we added a nearby library, which has significant cooling loads. We added a nearby school, that still didn't quite get us there. So it's still runaway heating, overheating. So we added a personal care home. We added nearby homes, which are very heating dominant. So when you added 26 homes, that helps a lot. But it actually wasn't enough. So we actually added more homes. So this is, and sorry, when I
Did anybody else lose Jacob's audio?
Yeah, I can't hear anymore.
Yep.
Oh no, just when things were, well, just when things have been interesting.
You can't hear me at all?
Yeah, it's good now.
You're back.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
good.
now.
Yeah, it's good.
Weird. So did you?
And then you accidentally muted yourself.
Oh, geez. What
There
a
we go.
disaster.
No,
So-
not a disaster. Way to model getting over it. Thank you.
And I stopped my video. What is happening? So did you guys hear me here?
Yeah, the balancing the load by adding more loads.
Yeah, so basically we added 109 homes, and now with one geosystem with 136 boreholes, you have all of these buildings on this site all sharing energy through one energy transfer pipe. So you basically you distribute the pipe, you have the loads from the buildings, and then you have a geosystem, and then more buildings, and then a geosystem. So you spread it out in GHX modules, which allows you to use a single transfer pipe and use one geosystem. So there's tons of opportunity. Like, it doesn't have to be a geosystem. You can use waste heat. You can use sewer heat recovery. You can use ponds. You can use data centers or cannabis facilities, which have huge amounts of waste heat. But I think the future is going to be in district systems and these low temperature ambient loops, which, take heat from one building and pass it to the next. So because that reduces our load, because all of that energy can be shared. And this is nothing new for developers. If you think about it right now, we're piping natural gas to every home. That's a distributed energy system. So why not just change it to a low temperature system? It's the exact same thing. We just have a shared resource, whether it's a sewer heat recovery system or a pond or a geosystem. So summary is stop building natural gas immediately. It's the riskiest thing you can do. Focus on energy efficiency first. Geo is one of the best bang for buck upgrades once you've done infiltration and energy recovery. Net zero is actually fairly easy, but you're probably going to have to take the active approach. It's probably going to be the cheapest way to get there. But because of lack of space, we're probably going to have to rely on community systems. And I just want to end it up with a quote. I love this quote by Noam Chomsky. Every decision we make now is a climate decision, and we're making a choice that no human history has ever had to make. We are deciding whether organized human society will survive. So every time we go to design a building, not only are you weighing the risks of the financial risks of the carbon tax and the fact that you're going to have to rip it out, but you're weighing all of these climate risks. And so we have to remember that these are all climate decisions. So that is it. I will open it up to questions and heckling and abuse.
Well, let's go easy on the abuse, folks. But we do have some questions in the chat. Divala, do you want to just jump on and explain maybe where you were in the presentation when you were wondering about still increasing ground heat over time?
Sure. This is Nathaniel de Avila, and I was curious a little bit. I saw in the modeling that I didn't catch the units that you had horizontally there for your x-axis, but it looked like your balanced models were still slowly increasing ground heat over time, and I was just kind of confused as to why that seemed that way.
Yeah, so and we often see that. So, and I'm not showing the scales properly, but essentially, if I showed you the scale of what is acceptable in terms of overheating versus how much it's slightly overheating, our models are typically conservative, so they actually won't overheat. But also the way geosystems work is they eventually reach a steady state. Well, they'll increase temperature for a bit and then they reach, so basically the more you heat reject, the faster they reject it, so to speak. So they usually reach a steady state. And that's really the key for geodesign is in the past, rules of thumb were used. They just used it based on the peak loads, right? And the peak load doesn't tell you how much energy you're taking out, how much you're putting back. So sometimes I've seen systems that they literally froze the ground. They created permafrost. And I've seen systems that are overheated. But they didn't engineer them. There was zero engineering done. And so that's the key, is to do the energy modeling, to understand the loads and to build it.
And if I can follow up
or
right
to
away,
account for it. Yeah, of course.
That's a great answer. I appreciate that. It adds another question, but I'll just stick with my other one. And you're always assuming for net zero that you're going to maximize your rooftop solar.
I mean, so it depends on the project. Like that Mosaic Center, the owner didn't want any solar on the site. Like he didn't want carports or like a landscaping. He wanted to keep it to the roof, which is why you saw some overhangs with solar PV. So in that project, we were limited. So obviously, we utilize as much roof space as we can. And depending on the project, sometimes the roof might not be enough, right? So you might have to use carports or something else, or you might simply not get to net zero, and that's okay. It's still going to give you a really efficient building that's, costs way less to operate, because it's not practical, especially as you go higher, high rise, you're stacking energy use onto a small footprint. You're never going to be able to get to net zero. So that's when you rely on grid. And I think in Manitoba, you guys have a pretty clean grid. So.
All right, we have a question here from Ken. Did you want to jump on, Ken, or do you want me to ask it for you? Feel free to jump on.
Well, I guess I had a couple questions. Maybe I'll just ask the first one. Have you ever tried to use outdoor snow melting of driveways and parking ramps and sidewalks and so on to balance the annual heating and cooling loads for commercial mixed use or MERB type buildings?
Yeah, absolutely. We look at that all the time. I mean, it has to be a very cooling dominant building. So there's a colleague worked on an IKEA store in Denver where they use the parquet, the truck ramp to reject heat. And we have another hospital in Fort McMurray, which actually again is cooling dominant. So basically what we're doing is when we see that the ground loop is getting too warm, we start to activate that snow melt system outside to reject heat. And in our climates, because we have large diurnal swings, meaning our nighttime temperatures are really low, you can reject heat even in the summer. So to answer your questions, yes, absolutely. And we've seen in horizontal systems in schools where you can melt snow, like you can actually use it to, get rid of snow shoveling and all that.
A second question was, do any of your projects use solar thermal for preheating ventilation air, such as solar wall? We've got a lot of good examples here in Winnipeg.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with the product. Part of the reason we don't recommend it anymore is I'd prefer to use a dual core energy recovery ventilator, like a TempF unit. If you're not familiar, they're 90% efficient. They use 2 cores. I had a picture up, and they're 90% efficient, and they flip cores every 60 seconds, so they never freeze up. Because the solar wall obviously is only giving you preheating that ventilation when the sun's rising, and it's one thing. But what if you get a week of cold air? I'd rather recover 90% all the time, and that basically, I think, energy-wise, that's always going to be more cost-effective than the solar wall, in our experience.
Thank you.
All right, we've got a question here from Lindsay, and just a note that it is 1 o'clock, so if people have to go, that's totally understandable. But Jacob has agreed to stick around to answer all the questions. So let's hear from you there, Lindsay.
Sorry, yeah, I was just wondering, from your experience, could you ballpark the cost associated with energy modeling and the ground source heat pump and associated field design what's a portion of a residential house project cost would go to that?
So we're going to
If you're
go
taking-
down a rabbit hole here because
Yeah.
we focus mostly on commercial. As you know, a residential market is tougher because the margins are thin. Homeowners don't want to pay $6,000-7,000 for a proper design, with drawings and everything, nor do I think it's necessary. So we have done designs for, homes that, were around $7,000-8,000, but I don't recommend that to homeowners. So there's some contractors in a residential market, there's still a lot of contractors that use rules of thumb for residential. Sometimes you can get away with it. Some of the better ones will use software and use size based on peaks. There is some residential software that is okay. So if you get a good contractor, you might be okay. For some, what we offer sometimes is for like $1,500, $2,000, we'll model the home, we'll export the loads, and we'll tell you how many boreholes you need and give you that design. And often in Alberta, like in Edmonton and Calgary, you need a stamped review anyways. So we'll give that to you and then you can shop it around. So basically, because the design isn't difficult for a 4 borehole system or 5 borehole system, but at least you'll know, because what drives me nuts is I went out to a home because they were having problems with their system and it had nothing to do with geo. It was the ductwork design and controls. But they had, for one home, they had 18 boreholes on that home. I've done commercial systems smaller than that. It was a big home, but it probably only needed 8 boreholes or 9. But because of rules of thumb and the contractor gets paid for every hole that he drills, he had 18 boreholes. That drives me nuts. That destroys the financial case for it. I mean, the system's going to run really well and efficient, but it drives me nuts. So even though we don't do residential that often, we do sometimes just offer that, like, look, we'll run a model. If we can't recommend a good contractor, we'll run a model, we'll tell you how many holes you need, and then that gives you power to shop that around. So, but the residential market, I will admit that the geo market in Canada is not where it needs to be. There's a lack of expertise, both in design, both in installation, and the prices are probably a bit high because the few that do good work probably charge a premium because they can. So this is going to change over the next 5-10 years. But yeah, I should add that to the disadvantages, is you kind of need to do some good research and know which ones are the good ones and bad ones. So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
So we have a question from Therese, if you just want to jump on and ask that about.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, I was just wondering why we can't bore down from a basement, because you're already partway down. You need to go another 4 feet at least or more. Like, is there just no technology that you can actually do that? Or
You mean from an existing basement?
Yeah, from an old house.
So there's rigs that go into existing parkades for like multi-story buildings, towers, but like we're talking about often a truck. Like you need to get a truck in, and there's like Google or Alphabet, I guess, they have a geo group called Dandelion that they're working on really reducing the size of the rig so they can get into these tight spots in homes. But even that, like, there's no way you can drive a rig into the basement. So we can put it under a new building, and we've done that several times. But yeah, it's not practical. We'd have to put a hole through the wall and then try to fit it. It probably wouldn't be tall enough anyways.
Sounds like a good excuse to install some awesome new windows. Just joking. All right, we have a question here from Andrea. Do you want to jump on and ask it?
Hi, I'm Andrea Lawson. I used to live in Manitoba and I work in schools. We use a lot of geo. I am now in Nova Scotia working on schools, but we don't cool our schools. Is there any possibility that we could still use geo?
Yeah, so we have this in Alberta as well. Their official policy is we don't cool schools. Um, and uh, and again, and I don't know in Nova Scotia whether it the sun requires it, but what people often miss is that with a good envelope and 30 kids and computers in a classroom, they do need cooling. And I have 9 friends that are teachers. They all wish we had cooling in schools. So what I will say though, if you're comparing to a system like in a warehouse where you're comparing geo to radiant tube heaters, or you're comparing geo to a school that only has baseboard radiators, you're going to have trouble making that sense financially. Most of our schools have some cooling, but they typically have VAV systems, really big. So they have perimeter radiant heating and then a big air handler with VAV boxes and all that. Guarantee you Geosystem is cheaper to install than that, and you get cooling as a bonus. But it depends on the systems that you install. So if it's similar, if you have radiant perimeter heaters with VAV systems, Geo can probably be cheaper. If it's just baseboard radiators, tough to make sense financially, although far be it for me to use that argument. I hate that argument. Financially, I think ethically, we have to decarbonize and move to these systems. But yeah, it's going to be sometimes a tough sell when you don't have cool, because you're essentially, and we see that often in social housing where they didn't plan for cooling. It's just, you're comparing it to cheap radiant heat, right? And like, good luck. It's not even the Geosystem premium is one thing, but now you're adding cooling. So now you're adding $7,000 per suite of mechanical equipment. But we have noticed that they're really overheating, and in one case they're having to retrofit cooling in because the suites are getting so hot. But so I don't know if that answers your questions, but yeah.
Thank you. We also have dirty electricity, right? So it makes it even harder.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Thank you. We have a question here from Daniel. Do you want to jump on and ask it?
Yeah, thanks very much for your presentation, Jacob. Really valuable. Our country needs lots of folks like you with the data, the experience, expertise. So great job. I'm really enthused hearing you and seeing your ability to back up your arguments and ideas. So thank you.
Thank you.
In terms of the solar thermal technology, as you know, in the 70s, it was all the rage, all the big federal buildings had it up, and it's all being either leaked and torn down or whatever. Very high efficiency. My guess is that Geo does thermal loads better. Is that why you haven't covered this technology? In terms of active solar, not the...
If you go to my website, you'll see that, if you go to our website, you'll see that we do solar thermal. I haven't recommended solar thermal in a decade. And there's a few simple reasons. And we have done actually one social housing project which had solar thermal and geo tied in. And we dump excess heat from the solar thermal into the ground loop to increase the efficiency. But in that case, the client didn't want cooling. And I warned him from the model. I'm like, guys, the suites we're showing them as 34 degrees because it had a really good envelope. They were going for passive. And I said, guys, the suites are getting up to 35 degrees. We need cooling. And they're like, no. What are they going to say if social housing projects have cooling? They didn't install cooling. We did low temperature radiators, super efficient in heating, but now they're retrofitting cooling, and it's no easy way to do it because we only have radiators. We don't have an air system. Anyways, the point is that for that case, we don't have cooling. So I don't mind. In the summer, we have all the excess heat from solar thermal. So we dump it into the ground loop. I don't want that in a typical system because I'm cooling in the summer. And if you're cooling in the summer and dumping heat, that means I'm wrecking my cooling efficiency, right? And especially if I've taken steps to make the building more cooling dominant with energy recovery, which reduces the heating load by 50%, with high solar heat gain windows, I've pushed that building to cool more. I don't want to wreck my cooling efficiency. The main reason I try to cool more is that if my heating efficiency is around 400%, my cooling can be like 900 because our ground temperature is relatively low, right? So I mostly don't recommend, like in a single family home, you can make that make sense because the cooling is such a low portion. And actually one of my colleagues, he installed his geo system 30 years ago. And if you don't know, in Winnipeg, you have one of the godfathers of geo, Ed Lorenz, with Geo Optimize. And he installed geo 30 years ago, and it was getting a bit cold. So he installed a cheap solar thermal panel to dump heat into this ground loop, and it works great now. But for most buildings, I don't want to ruin my cooling efficiency. The other reason I don't recommend solar thermal is when I need the most heat in the winter, I have the least amount of sun and the least amount of sun times. And when I need the least heat, I have the most in the summer. So then you have to reject it. So I'd rather put up a solar panel, which can use every ounce of energy that I collect instead of having to dump it when I don't need it. So it's cheaper. And so solar thermal systems aren't cheap either. So it absolutely would make more sense to just do geo and PV before thermal. Thermal can make sense for car washes, for industrial loads where you have really high, like even swimming pools, but that's so, but yeah, it's, I like thermal, but it's expensive and it's tough to make sense compared to the other technologies, especially with how cheap solar PV got.
Mm-hmm. I actually use an active air heating system on my house that circulates the air from the house through the panel and back into the house. It's a backpass system, active air system. It's not very common, and it switches to water heating in the summer. So it actually heats my house completely at -40.
Interesting.
The collectors heat up to about 65 degrees Celsius in the middle. It's quite astounding. So I know the technology works, but I understand what you're saying in terms of the larger installations and the geo compatibility.
Yeah, and it often just comes down to costs, right? Like we just compare, if we compare the cost of solar thermal to this and that, it just usually doesn't make sense.
Good. Thanks very much.
All right, we've got another question here from Kurt. And if anybody has a question that they don't want to type out, just put a little star or an X in the chat and I can call on you. So Kurt, take it away.
Well, first of all, I'll echo what Daniel said. Thank you, Jacob, for an excellent presentation. And I'll tell you why.
Kurt, your sound's not that great. Is there anything you can do?
Okay.
So maybe Kurt, while you figure that out, we'll just, oh yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So, last week we released a document called the Road to Resilience, and this is a strategy for how to build climate resilience in Manitoba. And one of the biggest, and in the chat, if anybody on the call is interested, there's a link to it. But one of the biggest challenges in that effort is to be able to heat all of our buildings, old and new, without natural gas. And we've quantified, like from Hydro's own numbers, currently Hydro is able to deliver about 6,000 megawatts on the coldest January night. And if all of our buildings were to be heated electrically with pure resistive heat, they estimate they'd have to add an additional 7,000 megawatts. So we're in our document, we're trying to tackle that problem. As you can well imagine, it's pretty difficult. And your suggestion of geothermal for existing residential buildings is a game changer, really interesting. But my question is this: if, like, the question in some of the questioners are asking about the cost for individual homeowners to install geothermal for their home, and rip up their yard, go through the engineering, etc., even insurance, legal, the whole bit. Well, we suggest in the document having it utility owned and district heating, and using horizontal borehole drilling under roadways and back lanes. And so using some waste heat from sewer systems, for example, and just using that area. I've heard of something like that in Gibson's Landing, but have you seen or heard of anything like that we can use as an example? That's my question.
So we're doing that a lot. And it's exploding all over the US and Canada. And so to give you an example, and if you look, I had an article, but take a look at what's happening in Boston. In Boston, they have, and all over the cities in the East Coast, they have really aging infrastructure, which is natural gas infrastructure, which is leaking methane like crazy. And methane, you know, is a really potent greenhouse gas. It's terrible, which is why natural gas is actually worse than coal when you actually account for methane leakage. But the utilities are looking at this cost, and they estimated about $9 billion to replace their aging infrastructure, but they don't want to do it because they know it's a stranded asset. So they're paying customers to install geosystems. There's utilities, actually I have a list. And the reason I have a list is because we're going to be talking to EPCOR, which is Edmonton Power Corporation here in Edmonton, and saying, why aren't you doing this? Because Enwave in Ontario is doing this. We're working with a home builder that is now doing this. We're working with, there's tons of utilities. So Otter Tail Power in Minnesota, Tennessee Power, New York, National Grid in New York, Con Edison, Eversource Boston, Heat website, Heat, HEET, and tons of utilities all over the East Coast and West Coast are starting to get into this because they realize natural gas is going away and they want to still be a utility. And as I mentioned, one of the challenges for geos is yes, some people have 30 grand to invest in their home for a geosystem, but the upfront cost is still the big barrier. So one thing that you guys should be looking at is PACE. Have you guys familiar with property assessed clean energy? That can be a game changer. It's basically a loan against your property taxes because it eliminates that upfront cost. But absolutely, utility scale is where this is going to have to go, because in some areas, you don't have the room to go geo. You don't have, or it's too dense, and so you won't have an option, right? So absolutely, utility scale, community scale is where this needs to go. And it's going to become big. And it basically, instead of paying ATCO Gas or whoever it is, Manitoba Hydro, or who's the gas utility in Manitoba?
Hydro.
Yeah,
Hydro owns gas too.
Okay. Well, I mean, for them, it'd be a natural fit, right? Because then instead of paying your bill for natural gas connection charges, you pay a geo connection charge. But at least then you're not subject to those fluctuations. And again, I think you touched on a big point is resistance heat and an air source heat pump have a huge problem with peak demand. Wherever you have peak demand charges, do not even think about an air source heat pump. It will destroy your bills. And it can actually ruin even one cold month. We've been getting these polar vortex months. You're going to get a $600 bill, like in 1 month, or it might just ruin your net zero goals. The demand charge is going to become a bigger thing. And so utilities, this just makes so much sense for them because it doesn't matter. They don't care what they own. I mean, ATCO Gas here, they own natural gas infrastructure. So now they're pushing hydrogen, which, don't get me started on the problems with hydrogen when it comes from methane. But it's in the end, they're going to have to do this because there's no way everybody's going to be able to. And actually, you wouldn't want to, because there's a lot of advantages when there's buildings on the same site, as we saw with that ice rink, that have like opposite heating cooling demands. You can share energy, which means you can avoid having to drill all those extra boreholes. So yeah, I absolutely think community energy is the way most communities are going to be built. It's going to take some time, but yeah.
Great, thank you. Diavela, sorry, I know I butchered your last name. I apologize.
No worries. I was just curious about coolants. I know we're doing a lot better than we were, say, 6 decades ago in terms of toxicity and like ecological effects of our coolant production. But where do you see that going if we make this transition and we're using an exponentially larger amount of coolants and producing them? Or maybe you don't have expertise in that area. That's
You
fine.
mean refrigerants or?
Refrigerants, sure.
Yeah. I mean, good question. Far be it for me to understand the impacts that this will have. There are CO2 refrigerants that are being used in heat pumps. They're every year they're phasing out some refrigerants right away, actually, that have climate warming potential. I don't know enough about the subject, how big of an impact it has. I mean, obviously, there's always, just like EVs have an impact with lithium and precious metals and all that, fundamentally, they're better. And the technology, there's already a bunch of battery research that is removing precious metals from the technology, from the batteries, right? And so I don't want to just blanket say, oh, it's going to get fixed. I don't know how much of an issue it is or how much of an issue it will be in the future, but yeah.
That's fair. Thanks.
All right, we've got a question from Ken Klassen.
Hi, I just want to follow up on the idea of district ground source heat pump systems in new developments. How do you address the mismatch in timing of construction? Because typically in Winnipeg, what we see in a new development is the houses are built, and then it takes many, many years before the school is finally built, the local recreational facility, and so on and so forth. So you have a tremendous, you eventually can have balanced loads, but it may take a decade or more before you can get all the facilities connected on a district loop. So how do you deal with that mismatch in timing?
Yeah, so one of the advantages of a low temperature, call it ambient system, is that let's say you install 30 homes in the first phase. You would only install enough geo capacity if you're using geo for that first phase. And so actually we're doing that in a project. So as you build phases, you simply add more boreholes. So it's not like a traditional high temperature system where you got that chicken and egg. You know you're going to have 1,000 units of heat required, but for the first 10 years, you only have 200. This, you can proportionately, excuse me, increase the capacity of your source as you build out the development. So the timing of when you add district piping and actually connect the building. So in one example, we have the building is going to have 7 buildings, or the development's going to have 7 buildings. So the first 2 buildings are just operating as if they had their own system. And then the 3rd and 4th building probably will as well. Once the next phases, we're going to add 1 pipe that connects them all. But the nice thing about building geosystem is that you can use 1 pipe. You don't have to use a supply return. You can basically pull heat, recharge, dump heat, recharge. And so it's very flexible that way.
Okay, thank you.
All right, our next question is coming from, I believe, Tim from Solar.
Do you think the federal government should give natural gas subsidies to Crown utilities? Can you maybe clarify that question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so recently the federal government is giving Efficiency Manitoba, for example, $32.5 million to improve the efficiency of homes that are using natural gas. So they're improving the envelope, so to speak. But you know, it's kind of a band-aid as I see it. We're not addressing the problem, the source of the problem, which is carbon. How do you feel about that?
I 100% agree. And actually, I sit on the Transition Advisor Committee to City Council here in Edmonton. And this is a theme that always comes up, is we see these half measures as actually a huge barrier to change. Because when somebody just spent $10,000 on windows or insulation, guess what? They don't want to spend another 30 to change it from natural gas to something else. We see incremental upgrades as a barrier to the deep energy retrofits that we need. So are envelope improvements bad? Of course not. But it needs to be an all-out approach where we stop. We always laugh about this. Like I always say that the easiest way to get off fossil fuels is to get off fossil fuels. It's crazy, I know, but you know, the
Carbon is
we
carbon.
get CHP combined heat and power is being pushed by a bunch of traditional and natural gas people now. It's like, hey, we can get off natural gas by using more natural gas, and I'm like, you are fundamentally crazy. So yeah, it's just, we need to stop. We need to let off the gas. You know, we're on this runaway train and we're like, should we get off the gas? You know, like it's fundamentally every new home that's built that isn't net zero is increasing our emissions, and we need to be decreasing our emissions. So it's just lunacy.
Good to hear. Thank you.
Great, and we have a question from Therese again.
Hi, I just wanted to get back to what you're saying about Boston and some other places, especially in the United States, and how they're retrofitting geothermal into their older communities. And I think you said that they are paying homeowners to put in geothermal. And is that on a district system, or is that they're actually going to individual homeowners and saying, we'll help you get this installed in your home?
It depends on the project, but a lot of the utilities will pay for individual systems as well. They will own and maintain the equipment and lease it to you, basically. In the same way that some people are releasing solar panels and stuff like that. Because fundamentally, they don't want to put in more infrastructure. And I'm sure there's other systems, like obviously if you want to retrofit that whole community, and that's hopefully what we get to, and what, but yeah, from my understanding is right now, a lot of the utilities are just saying, here, we'll pay for your drilling on your site and you pay us a utility fee.
Okay, and then for like an older house in our area, about 2,000 square feet, how much, once you've bored the holes, how much is the system that you put in to run the heat in the house?
The heat pump is typically $9,000 installed. The price has gone up partly because the US dollar and stuff like that. We don't have a lot of Canadian manufacturers, but yeah, if you think about it, the cost of a new condensing furnace is $4,000 to $5,000. Air conditioning is going to cost you another $4,000 to $5,000. So you replace that with a heat pump that can do both. Your premium is the drilling. That's typically what you would say. Rule of thumb, I would say the cost of drilling is what your premium is.
Okay,
but yeah, go ahead.
And the drilling, if there was 4 boreholes, that runs about 8,000 as well.
It depends on the area. In the Winnipeg area, you guys have a very high bedrock or
water table.
Yeah, like you have sand. What's the shit? I'm running out of words. My brain is broken at this point. But basically, you hit bedrock at like 60 or 80 feet. So they either drill a bunch of. They're actually, it's very cheap to drill a bunch of small boreholes, but you need room. So sometimes you have to go through. So then the drilling costs go up. But yeah, I mean, you're going to look at $20,000-$25,000 for the drilling costs. It's, again, for homes, the homes is the worst case scenario for geo in terms of financial payback. With the carbon tax, though, where it is, your payback, I mean, fundamentally what the carbon tax did is that your payback's never more than 2030. Because if you add up, just look at your gas bill and look at what you're going to pay in 2030 every month, that's basically your paybacks, that it's capped at that point. So, and then if you account for natural gas prices where they're going to be, assume you're going to be about a 10-year payback if natural gas prices go up slowly. But if I expect, my thought is that in the next few years, you're going to see natural gas prices go up quite a bit. They never go up gradually. As we see with oil prices, natural gas is one of the most volatile fossil fuels.
Yeah, Manitoba Hydro did have a great program years ago, and they upgraded everybody's furnace, their natural gas furnace, and it was $20 on your bill over 5 years.
They used to also, Manitoba used to have loans, $20,000 towards geo. I don't think they have that anymore. Yeah. Manitoba was one of the leaders for that stuff like that. So you guys have a lot of geo.
You know
and they
when
were
that
pushing it
ended?
in schools.
You know when that ended?
Not sure. There is stuff coming from the feds. So slowly, and then again, property assessed clean energy, PACE, look, like as a group, you guys need to be pushing PACE, because PACE is awesome because it's basically, it pays for the geo or solar or whatever, and then you pay back the loan through your property taxes. So the upgrade is tied to the home, not the homeowner, which is a fantastic way to do it.
Oh, okay. And how do you access that?
You need to lobby your government to pass legislation that allows for PACE, and then your municipality has to implement it. So province of Alberta passed PACE legislation, which wasn't perfect. It didn't allow for private money. And so now Edmonton is starting a pilot soon with PACE, but it's just getting going. But it's huge in the US, and it's amazing what can happen.
Okay, neat. Thank you so much. This has been amazing.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that this has been amazing. We just have one final question. We'll call this at the end from Neil.
Structural piles. Yeah, we have there are systems that are done where you put the boreholes in the structural piles. Typically, they're not that deep, so you don't get that much depth, so you don't get that much capacity. So short answer is you can get some capacity out of it, but maybe like 10, 15, 20%. So you'd have to drill boreholes regardless. So.
And that was about incorporating geo boreholes into structural boreholes. So yes.
Yeah, structural piles. Yeah.
Thank you.